Crowds in Party. By Jodi Dean. Verso, 2016. Chapter 2. Enclosing the subject. Subject is a concept that continues to trouble political theory. Does subject direct us toward initiative and autonomy, or subjugation and constraint? Efforts to decenter the subject, whether targeting Cartesianism, Hegelianism, Marxism, or humanism, grapple with the challenge of accounting for order and initiative, submission and resistance, freedom and determination. Theorists and activities inspired by other traditions get roped into these debates when they construe politics in terms of the thoughts, actions, or feelings of individuals. Not only is agency privileged over structure, but the presumption that agents are individuals formats the alternative of autonomy or subjugation as an opposition between individual and collective. Collectivity comes to be associated with constraint, with preventing rather than enabling creativity and initiative. Liberal political theorists explicitly construe political agency as an individual capacity. Others take the individuality of the subject of politics for granted. I argue that the problem of the subject is a problem of this persistent individual form, a form that encloses collective political subjectivity into the singular figure of the individual. The first part of the chapter sets up the idea of enclosure via an inversion of Louis Althusser's famous claim that ideology interpellates individuals as subjects. The point of this inversion is less to critique Althusser than it is to provide a heuristic that can loosen the hold of the individual form on conceptions of political subjectivity. I demonstrate this point by putting the inverted formula, the subject is interpolated as an individual, in conversation with work in post-structuralist and psychoanalytic theory. The second part of the chapter tracks the enclosing of the subject in the individual form as it appears in the encounter between psychoanalysis and crowd theory, more specifically, in Sigmund Freud's appropriation of the notorious Gustave Le Bon. Continuing the argument from Chapter 1, my goal is to break free from the individualizing assumptions that hinder understanding the political subject as a collective subject. The individual form encloses collective bodies, ideas, effects, and sensations into a singular, bounded body. The link between individuality and political subjectivity, however, is neither necessary nor natural. It is in effect contingent to the array of processes that converge in bourgeois modernity. Just as the commodity is a form for value, so is the individual a form for subjectivity. It is a form that impedes collective political subjectivity by separating it into and containing it within individuated bodies and psyches. C. B. Macpherson's presentation of 17th-century liberalism is one of the clearest expositions of this vision of the individual. Macpherson argues that at the heart of liberal theory is a possessive individual conceived as the proprietor of his own person or capacities, owing nothing to society for them. He uses Thomas Hobbes and John Locke as his examples. In Macpherson's reading, for Hobbes and Locke the essence of being human is freedom from dependence on the wills of others, and freedom is a function of possession. They understand the individual neither primarily as a part or member, nor as fundamentally and irrevocably dependent on relations with others, human and non-human. Rather, the individual is in essence one who owns himself and his capacities. What's at stake here is less Macpherson's reading of Hobbes and Locke, which is contestable, than his highlighting of liberalism's mutual constitution of individual and owner. Ownership relies on and is produced through a series of separations and enclosures. Capacities are separate from others as well as separate from a self, which encloses these capacities within its person. Instead of entailing collective reproduction for common good, training, whether moral or technical, is work on and for the self. Cut off from the settings that produce and enable them and enclosed within the individual, capacities are objects of individual concern, so many objects available for exchange and, as capitalism expands, for investment, stylization, and branding. Although liberal theory treats the individual as an owner and therefore a locus of freedom, the codependence of the commodity form and the individual form works in another direction as well, one that enables elision between commodity and individual. In his gripping account of the antebellum slave trade in the United States, Walter Johnson describes the importance of individuation in the dismantling of slave families and the categorizing and fashioning of slaves for the market. Johnson writes, on the one hand, they were to be transformed into exemplars of the category to which they had been assigned, But once the categories of comparison had been established and embodied, the slaves were supposed to once again become visible as individuals. To be priced, slaves had to be comparable. To be sold, they had to be distinctive enough, individuated enough, to stand out from the crowd. The individuality of the marketed slave was produced for purchase. The elision between commodity and individual evidenced in the slave trade demonstrates that there is nothing necessarily or essentially liberating about the individual form. As I consider below, it emerges historically as an ideological mechanism for the desubjectification of collectives. The individual, and, as we shall see, not only in its liberal, possessive variety, is a form of capture. The subject is interpolated as an individual. Louis Althusser's reworking of the Marxian notion of ideology presents the category of the subject as constitutive of ideology. It is constitutive of ideology because the function of ideology is constituting concrete individuals as subjects. This function, Althusser argues, is a characteristic of ideology in general. Ideology transforms individuals into subjects. He names the operation at work in this transformation interpolation. Presenting interpolation as a hail or call, Althusser illustrates it with a policeman shouting "Hey, you there!" and a person turning around in response. With this turn in response, the individual becomes a subject. He has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him, and that it was really him who was hailed, and not someone else. Interpolation, then, is a process of subjection. Becoming subject, the individual both takes on and comes under ideology's structure of beliefs and expectations. Althusser's account of interpolation does not imply that there are individuals out there prior to interpolation. Invoking Freud and the rituals and expectations accompanying the birth of a child, that happy event, he insists that an individual is always already a subject, even before she is born. A child is born into a structure that has already subjected it, a structure that gives it a name, a sex, and a place and expects it to fill this place, be this sex, and carry this name to become the subject it already is. The example of the hail notwithstanding, ideological interpolation is not a singular event. It is constant and ongoing, embedded in material practices of recognition and misrecognition which guarantee for us that we are indeed concrete, individual, unmistakable and, naturally, irreplaceable subjects. As Elizabeth Wingrove writes, Althusser's theory of ideology thus explains how actors' subjectivity, which is to say, their awareness of themselves as unique, relatively independent, and capable of making choices, is achieved and sustained by virtue of their subjection to the rules, practices, and relations of the multiple apparatuses within a given social formation. Subjectivity, or individuality, which in Althusser's discussion is the same thing, is an effect of the larger ideological material structure. One of the most influential of Althusser's contributions, the idea of ideological interpolation, has come under significant criticism. Paul Hirst points out that Althusser's concept of subject supposes that subjects and individuals correspond, that the subject is the unitary identity of the individual, that the subject effect corresponds to the classic philosophical conception of consciousness. Judith Butler highlights the unelaborated doctrine of conscience underpinning Althusser's description of the individual's turn in response to the hail, finding there a guilty embrace of the law. And Jacques Rancière criticizes the Althusserian theory of ideology for its exclusion of class struggle, its positing of a function for ideology independent of the existence of classes. He charges Althusser with missing what was already clear to Marx: ideological forms are the forms in which a struggle is fought out. Approaching Althusser from the perspective of psychoanalysis, Millard challenges yet another line of critique, one which faults Althusser for positing a clean-cut, a sudden passage from the individual, a pre-ideological entity, a sort of material prima to the subject. This critique misses its mark, Dollar argues, because the real problem with Althusser's version of subjectivization is that the subject's illusory belief in its own autonomy is never as total as Althusser implies. Interpolation itself produces a remainder for which Althusser cannot account. Psychoanalysis proceeds from this remainder, the flaw at the heart of the individual subject. Dollar writes, for Althusser, the subject is what makes ideology work. For psychoanalysis, the subject emerges where ideology fails. The illusion of autonomy may well be necessary, but so is its failure. The cover-up never holds fast. As Slavoj Žižek emphasizes, the difference between the Althusserian and psychoanalytic views of the subject is that psychoanalysis emphasizes the ineliminable gap between ideology and individual. It does so not to naturalize an individual specificity perpetually out of ideology's reach but to treat the subject itself as nothing but this gap. My wager is that Althusser got it backwards. Ideological interpolation makes more sense as a theory of individuation than as a theory of subjection, which would account for the identity of subject and individual that remained a thorny problem in Althusser's different theorizations of ideology. Warren Montag provides support for this inversion. He highlights Althusser's claim that ideology recruits its bearers. Individuals are picked from an undifferentiated mass, singled out, removed from it and endowed with a unique identity, as if such a singling out or separation of individuals were necessary to the functioning of the economy. Confronting a crowd or mass, the ideological Hale fragments it into singular elements. Montag notes the specific resonance of Althusser's use of the term interpellate in the context of the protests and demonstrations of the 1960s. One would be stopped by the police and therefore singled out from the crowd or singularized in relation to a background. What was a crowd becomes so many separable individuals. Rather than following Althusser's emphasis on ideology in general, inverting his claim to attend to the interpellation of the subject as an individual narrows the focus to bourgeois ideology, and thereby returns class conflict to the theory of ideology. I use bourgeois ideology to refer to the loose set of ideas and apparatuses associated with European modernity, an instrumental concept of reason, and the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. The Protestant Reformation exemplifies bourgeois ideology's interpellation of the subject as an individual. Breaking with the communality of Catholicism, Protestant theologies hail believers as singular souls responsible for their own salvation. Effects of the interpellation of the subject as an individual include the reduction of agency to individual capacity, freedom to individual condition, and property to individual possession. They include as well the supposition that aggregates, groups, tribes, collectivities, and crowds are unavoidably primitive, barbaric, irrational, and atavistic. The advantage of reversing the Althusserian account is that the subject is not pre-constrained to the individual form, a form that psychoanalysis teaches is always already as failing and impossible as it is assumed and demanded. With this reversal, the individual form itself becomes a problem, the coercive and unstable product of the enclosure of the common in never-ceasing efforts to repress, deny, and foreclose collective political subjectivity. The individual is a form of capture. Rather than natural or given, the individual form encloses into a singular bounded body collective bodies, ideas, affects, desires, and drives. Althusser's claim that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence should be reread with the emphasis on individuals. What is imaginary is that the conditions ideology organizes relate primarily to an individual. The individual is itself an imaginary figure, as we learn from Lacan. Bourgeois ideology treats conditions that are collective and social, embedded in histories of violence and systems of exploitation, as if they were relationships specific to an individual, as if states arose through individual consent, as if politics were a matter of individual choice, and as if desires and capacities, affects and will naturally originate from and reside in an individual form. But just as collective experience of antagonism, the social substance underlies what Marx calls the phantom-like objectivity of the commodity, so too does it underlie the phantom-like subjectivity of the individual. Enclosing the common. Inverting Althusser helps us conceive the individual as a form of enclosure. As Marx describes in Capital, enclosure is an operation through which what is common is seized and put into service for capitalism. Judith Butler's account of the constitution of the subject in language, an account that itself draws from Althusser, provides a way to access this operation insofar as the linguistic category of the subject designates a condition of common belonging. Quotation by Butler. The genealogy of the subject as a critical category suggests that the subject, rather than be identified strictly with the individual, ought to be designated as a linguistic category, a placeholder, a structure in formation. Individuals come to occupy the site of the subject as the linguistic occasion for the individual to achieve and reproduce intelligibility, the linguistic condition of its existence and agency. End of quotation by Butler. That individuals come to occupy the place of the subject implies that more than one necessarily occupies this place at the same time. Because subject is the linguistic condition for intelligibility and its function is to hold open a place, the utterly singular and unique would have no place. The utterly singular would be illegible within the available terms of existence and agency. Individual thus designates a specific occupation of the subject understood as a common place. As a subject, the individual can only be one occupant among many. The singularity of its subject status is purely imaginary. Subject is a condition for agency because the individuality of agency is a fantasy occluding the material and collective conditions for action, contracting them into an imaginary ego. Butler associates the individual's occupation of the position of the subject, its subjection, with foreclosure. As the individual is subjectified, it loses something of itself, even if this is something it never had. To be a subject is to be, in a way, bereft. Butler suggests that the subject is a condition of freedom at the cost of freedom, where this lost or sacrificed freedom is a kind of authenticity or potential for love and desire that would be available to the subject were it not for the law to which the subject is beholden. One cannot criticize too far the terms by which one's existence is secured. Understanding the subject as interpolated as an individual, however, opens up another possibility. The bereavement accompanying interpolation arises from the loss of others. The individual is the one cut off from, cut out of, the collective. Caught in the isolation of the imaginary ego, the individual tries to do and be alone what she can only do and be with others. Already in Discipline and Punish, Michel Foucault treats the individual as an effect of power and knowledge as he details the making of the individual through the extension of disciplinary formulae of domination in 18th-century Europe. Discipline involves a range of mutually reinforcing techniques employed to solve the problem collective people create for authority. The state needs the army, but an armed assembly of the people can overthrow the state. Capital needs labor, but the concentrated power of the workers can render useless, destroy, and effectively abolish capitalist investment in raw material and means of production. Over the course of the 18th century, processes of enclosing, partitioning, functionalizing, and ranking spread throughout the social to turn the motley, amorphous, unruly mass into a docile, useful, combination of forces. Vagabonds and paupers are confined. Workers are closed off into factories. A monastic model becomes the ideal for secondary schools. The army, that vagabond mass, is regularized into a more regimented military, separated into barracks in order to prevent looting and violence. The enclosed are then partitioned off from one another, each individual has his own place, and each place is individual. Avoid distribution in groups, break up collective dispositions, analyze confused, massive or transient pluralities. As Foucault makes clear, enclosure and segmentation accompany not only technological developments, the punctuation and measuring of time, and the correlation of bodies and gestures, but also important changes in the work of power on bodies. These changes in the mode of power's operation on bodies increase opportunities to observe and gain knowledge of them and to put this knowledge to use in securing their combined utility and docility. Discipline makes individuals, Foucault writes. The crowd, a compact mass, a locus of multiple exchanges, individualities merging together, a collective effect, is abolished and replaced by a collection of separated individualities. Observed and compared, bodies, aptitudes, and capacities are individuated as they are classified in relation to one another. Evaluated and rewarded, they shed their quality as mass and take shape as trained, specified, and knowable individuals. As an effect of the enclosure of the crowd, individuation is fundamentally, and deliberately, depoliticizing, the fantasies of liberals notwithstanding. Put back in terms of a question Althusser poses in his discussion of ideological state apparatuses, what do children learn at school? They learn that they are individuals. Silvia Federici deepens and extends Foucault's account of the material production of the individual in modern Europe. Tracing the peasant uprisings, popular heresies, and witch hunts inseparable from the bloody processes of capital accumulation, Federici connects the disciplinary enclosure of the workforce with the accumulation of differences, inequalities, hierarchies, divisions, which have alienated workers from each other and even from themselves. She attends to demographic and economic crises in the first decades of the 17th century, crises involving dramatic population declines in Europe and the New World and leading to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, situating there the emergence of reproduction and population growth as matters of intellectual and state concern. A particular focus of the mercantilists, state preoccupation with population growth results in attempts to expropriate from women their reproductive labor, rendering them literally and physically a source of labor power as it differentiates between men's and women's work, devalues the work of women, and demonizes their knowledge of reproduction and the body. Moreover, as the ruling classes endeavor to impose ever stricter discipline on an unruly workforce, inefficient social activities like gaming and drinking come under heavy scrutiny and regulation. Unproductive sexuality is forbidden. Federici affiliates these developments with the rationalism of Descartes and Hobbes. She attributes the popularity of Cartesianism among middle and upper-class Europeans to its provision of a model of self-management crucial for capitalism's need for a reliable, predictable, and calculable workforce. Cartesianism provides a new model of the person, where the self works on itself, training, controlling, and stylizing its body, now configured as something other, something possessed. The product of this alienation from the body, Federici writes, was the development of individual identity, conceived precisely as otherness from the body, and in perennial antagonism with it. As she concludes, this emergence of an alter ego represents the birth of the individual in capitalist society. Rather than belonging to the world exists in order to belong to it. Foucault's and Federici's explorations into the disciplinary production of the individual supply ample reason to replace the idea of the individual's interpellation as a subject with that of the subject's interpellation as an individual. The individual is a product of European modernity, the form through which collective economic force is politically secured so as to facilitate the processes of its own exploitation. Bourgeois ideology, manifest in the disciplinary techniques that make individuals, hails the collective subject, the mass of workers, vagabonds, soldiers, and students, as individuals, even as the capacity of the common people for individuated self-discipline in the service of capital accumulation and liberal order will persist as a problem. It singles out and separates, producing the very individuals it extracts. Nonetheless, Foucault cannot explain how disciplinary techniques and processes subjectify order subjectify the individuated. Where is the gap of subjectivity in the web of its determinations? We gain an understanding of bourgeois ideology's regime of individuation at the cost of the foreclosed collective. Federici takes a step toward such an explanation when she gestures to an emergent alter ego, an incomplete individuation or individual that remains somehow plural. Psychoanalysis, built around the failures of the individual form, helps carry the explanation further. For psychoanalysis there is no such thing as an individual, Jodi writes. The individual only makes sense as a knot of social ties, a network of relations to others, to the always already social other, the other being ultimately but a shorthand for the social instance as such. Below, I turn to Freud's discussion of group psychology and the analysis of the ego as a resource for a psychoanalytically attuned inquiry into political subjectivization, excavating from his account the collectivity enclosed in the individual. The subject is the gap in the structure. Before I turn to Freud, however, I want to mention an additional advantage to rethinking ideology as the interpellation of the subject as an individual, namely, making political sense out of the idea from Dollard and Zizek that the subject is nothing but the gap in the structure. Because Althusser takes as his problem the compliance of individuals with a system that oppresses them, he has trouble conceiving the system as itself a social product, or product of conflict. Institutions are external to the subjects they produce. Dollard and Zizek, in presenting the limits of interpellation as the subject, could be seen as making the problem worse in that they have to posit the continuity of interpellating institutions that always fail. After all, they suggest that the subject as such is hysterical, resisting the interpellative hail, perpetually refusing the identity offered to her. How, though, would an institution continue if its hail were persistently resisted? One possible answer would be that the subject is rare, the unique individual, or individual in the moment of uniqueness, the heroine capable of going to the limit, doing the impossible. Institutions would then be understood as persisting because most of the time they work, but this working is not through the successful production of subjects, it's through the production of objects. Another answer would shift registers altogether. Reconceptualizing the problem in terms of the concept of subjectivity. If for Althusser subjectivity consists in the identity that emerges in response to the hail, for Dollar and Zizek subjectivity consists in the gap produced and occluded by answering the hail. These two options of unique or void, unconditioned or ineliminable, are politically unsatisfying. Politics diminishes into waiting for the impossible arrival of one who cannot make much of a difference anyway. Fortunately, these are not the only options. Reversing Althusser's formulation so as to understand ideology as interpolating the subject as an individual provides another option. The subject emerges where ideology fails because the subject is collective. When bourgeois ideology fails, individuation fails and the fact of collectivity impresses itself. A problem faced by one becomes a condition shared by many. Correspondingly, the subject is a gap in the structure because the people are the subject of politics. Subject is therefore not primarily a linguistic site of individual freedom, decision, or choice. Nor does it index the unconscious fantasies that fill in and direct the never-complete structure. Rather, subject is a gap in three other intertwined senses: structure's inability to ground or posit itself, its dependence on something external to it, and the torsion of the real in the excess of its self-relation. In their self-relating, the people always come up against themselves. They encounter the practical, material limits of their association, the psychic and affective pressures of their commonality, and the effects of histories of conflict and conquest. The excess of their reflective relation to themselves as the people is the torsion of politics. Politics takes place in the non-identity, gap, or torsion between people and their self-governance. Political subjectivization involves forcing this non-identity, making it felt as an effect of a subject. As Bruno Bostiels puts it in a discussion of Alain Badiou, subject consists in the coherence of a forced lack. But not just any gap is that of the subject. Subject appears through the active occupation of the constitutive lack in the people. There is politics because the political subject is collective and it is split. This split is practical and material, the condition of our physical being. The people can never be politically, or, differently put, the people is not an ontological category. They are only present as parts, as subsets. This is the case with crowds occupying public squares, elected assemblies, armies in battle, and opinion polls. All are necessarily parts. Their partiality, the gap between parts and, imaginary, whole, is the exciting cause of political subjectivization. Moreover, even as parts, the people are only present temporarily. They may try to inscribe their presence, their having been, in documents, practices, and organizations which will take their place and operate in their stead, a taking and operating which is also and unavoidably partial. Some degree of alienation is unavoidable. Making something ourselves, building collectives, creating new institutions cannot eliminate the minimal difference between the collectivity and the people. The condition of politics, then, is this practical material split between the people and the collective that actually comes together. Expressed in Rousseauian terms, the general will does not follow from the will of all. The split in the people is also an effect of the group on its members in the sense that the people are never fully identical with their sovereignty. Groupness exerts a force that is more than the sum of individual expectation. The expectations of groups work back upon their members. People have them of each other as well as of themselves, and they have them of each other and themselves in ways of which they are never fully conscious. This excess manifests itself in the point of reference from which a collectivity views itself as a collective, a point sometimes occupied by a leader or held in place by a proper or common name. A name forces a gap in the collectivity it names, inscribing the non-all character of the collectivity and providing a new terrain of struggle. We argue over the name. The common name can never fully designate, capture and enclose the collectivity even as the collectivity cannot relate to itself absent a structuring form. The split in the people goes all the way down. It can't be limited to the idea that some are excluded from the people, and hence that including them would solve the problem of the gap. Nor can it be rendered as the problem of representation, and hence addressed via ontology. Rather, the people do not know what they want. They are not fully present to themselves. Conflicting and contradictory desires and drives render the people a split subject perpetually pushing to express, encounter, and address its own non-knowledge. Returning to the idea given by Zizek and Dollar, as the collective subject of politics, the people is nothing but this gap. I have proposed an inversion of the Althusserian account of ideology and suggested some of the conceptual benefits that accompany it. An understanding of the subject as interpolated as an individual resonates with linguistic ideas of the subject, better fits with Althusser's own description of ideological recruitment, and attends to the historicity of the individual in bourgeois modernity. Even more, it lets us begin to explore the gaps constitutive of collective subjectivity and thereby further loosen the grip of the individual form. Insofar as he fails to uncouple subject and individual and consider the crowd out of which the hailed individual is recruited, Althusser naturalizes enclosure. To be sure, he is working on the terrain of a psychoanalysis that has already enclosed the collective subject in the individual form. If we turn to Freud's group psychology and the analysis of the ego, we can see how this enclosing is accomplished. There Freud presents the individual form as a product of the enclosure of the crowd. A return to Freud, and to his primary interlocutor in group psychology, the notorious Gustave Le Bon, reanimates the crowd as it highlights the displacement of many by one. Attending to this crowd contributes to the dismantling of the phantom-like subjectivity of the individual by locating in the crowd the dynamics of a collective subject. The unconscious is a crowd. In Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, 1921, Freud concerns himself with man as a member, man in his belonging to. How is it that that to which man belongs to him? These concerns lead Freud to discuss problems of identification, attachment, and the intensification of affect. Freud's turn to group psychology brings psychoanalysis into dialogue with crowd theory, a field of work emerging in late 19th century social science out of discussions in biology, criminology, psychology, and sociology, and out of fears incited by the revolutionary crowds of the Paris Commune of 1871. Crowd theorists wanted to understand what they saw as the dangerous irrationality of the crowd, why people in large groups seem to become more emotional, instinctual, and even primitive. In pre-disciplinary or even interdisciplinary style, crowd theorists used evolution to rank human civilizations, hypnosis to explain imitation in groups, and medicine to diagnose crowd pathology. At the time of Freud's intervention, crowd theory was well established and widely accepted. Freud enters the conversation as a way to expand the influence of the newer field of psychoanalysis by demonstrating how psychoanalysis better accounts for group behavior. While he engages several different crowd theorists, Freud relies most heavily on the work of Gustave Le Bon. Le Bon was a pessimistic conservative who presented his racist, elitist, and misogynist ideas as scientific discoveries. His immensely popular 1895 book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, consolidated literary and historical accounts of the crowd from Émile Zola and Hippolyte Taine with work on criminal crowds from Scipio Sull and Gabriel Dard. The Crowd announced to its readers that they were entering an era of crowds, capitalization in the original. It instructed them to fear it. It was certainly possible, Le Bon warned, that the advent to power of the masses marks one of the last stages of Western civilization, a complete return to those periods of confused anarchy which seem always destined to precede the birth of every new society. The masses were now in charge, and the most likely result was the collapse of civilization. The Crowd appeared at a time of increasing worker militancy. In France, the number of workers in syndicates tripled between 1890 and 1900. The number of strikes quadrupled over 2 decades. In 1886, in the dramatic miners' strike in Decazeville, workers threw a deputy director of the company out of a window. He was then mauled to death by the crowd. In 1890, plans for massive May Day demonstrations prompted the government to garrison 38,000 troops in Paris to avert what some feared would be a resurgence of the Commune. Le Bon offered his theory of the crowd as guidance for understanding this new era, even though he thought little could be done to shape it. His subsequent fascist admirers try to disprove this second point by drawing from his work in their efforts to stir and channel mass feeling. Le Bon's account of crowds arises out of his antipathy toward the transformation of the popular classes into governing classes. Lamenting that the divine right of the masses is about to replace the divine right of kings, Le Bon decries the way association, far more than universal suffrage, is making the masses conscious of their strength. They are founding syndicates and labor unions, before which authorities capitulate. They aim to limit the hours of labor, nationalize mines, railways, factories, and soil, equalize the distribution of products, and eliminate the upper classes. The claims of the masses, Le Bon warns, amount to nothing less than a determination to utterly destroy society as it now exists, with a view to making it hark back to that primitive communism which was the normal condition of all human groups before the dawn of civilization. Le Bon's findings confirmed and amplified already intense anxieties among the elite. A primary concern of the 19th-century crowd theorists was how it was that law-abiding individuals could act like criminals when they were combined together in a crowd. Le Bon's answer is that a crowd is a new collective being. Assembly into a crowd results in new psychological characteristics as all the thoughts and feelings of the collectivity are turned in an identical direction. Under conditions that Le Bon attributes to exciting causes, something emerges that is not present in individuals alone, just as in chemistry, certain elements, when brought into contact, bases and acids, for example, combine to form a new body possessing properties quite different from those of the bodies that have served to form it. Despite his claims to originality, Le Bon steals this idea from some, who had been involved in a public dispute with Tard over who deserved credit for originating crowd theory. Plagiarizing both, Le Bon schematizes the tropes that had by that time become inseparable from the crowd concept: contagion, suggestion, affective intensification, and de-individualization. The vehicle for Le Bon's schematization is the unconscious. He writes, "The substitution of the unconscious actions of crowds for the conscious activity of individuals is one of the principal characteristics of the present age. It is this emphasis on the unconscious that provides the opening for psychoanalysis." In group psychology, Freud joins the crowd theory discussion via a twist. Not only is the crowd unconscious but the unconscious is itself a crowd. Freud thus accepts Le Bon and inverts Le Bon. The inversion is possible because Le Bon's own concept of the crowd is psychological. Le Bon does not view crowds as a mass of bodies in the street. Crowd involves a concentration and directionality that encompasses people in a specific place and that extends to a wide array of structured institutions, parliament and jury, and imaginary communities, race and nation. More than a set of social relations, crowd for Le Bon is a process, like those microbes which hasten the dissolution of enfeebled or dead bodies, or force in which individuals get caught. Ideas, sentiments, emotions and beliefs possess in crowds a contagious power as intense as that of microbes. Early 21st century commentators will describe the same phenomena with terms like cascade effects, bandwagoning, confirmation bias, and bubbles. Informed by 19th century science, Le Bon affiliates crowd processes with hallucination, barbarism, and the direction of the spinal cord instead of the brain. He correlates the strength of these processes with the dangers of crowd power, the last surviving sovereign force of modern times and the only force that nothing menaces. Le Bon conceives the unconscious racially as a hereditary substratum of similarity upon which individual differences are built. The unconscious encompasses a wide array of instincts and passions, affections and aversions, passed down through the generations. Vastly more influential than the mind's conscious life, the unconscious always threatens to subsume the individual's independent intellectual aptitudes, themselves the fragile achievements of reason, education, and elite culture. In a crowd, common characteristics overpower the rare achievements of intelligence. Ordinary qualities triumph over distinction and specialization. As Le Bon puts it, these qualities in crowds become common property. No matter their differences in occupation, intelligence, character, or mode of life, individuals in a crowd possess a collective mind, what Le Bon attributes to the psychological law of the mental unity of crowds. I should add that anxiety about subjection to the crowd, or, differently put, the fragility of the individual as a form of subjectivity, comes to characterize over a century of inquiry into the crowd, from Durkheim, through Mill, through 20th century American sociology's emphasis on the mass and conformity. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Freud treats the unconscious as a crowd in two senses. The first is an analytical structural sense of the repressed product of history, whether a family or species, as it impresses itself within the individual. Freud commends Le Bon's discussion of the unconscious because it resonates so well with his own, adding that as a matter of fact none of the author's statements bring forward anything new. The second is a more analogical sense where the unconscious is described in terms of the affective dynamics of the crowd. The forces in the unconscious are like the directed intensities of crowd processes. Freud shifts back and forth between these two senses in his attempt to explain the nature of group ties and the emergence of individual from group psychology. These explanations never quite cohere. Mikkel-Book-Jacobson challenges the Freudian postulate of the unity of the subject of the unconscious, suggesting instead that it is multiple, unascribable, and unidentifiable. In a deconstructive reading of psychoanalysis's binaries of subject and other, desire and object, Book-Jacobson draws from René Girard to treat desire as primarily mimetic, positing a primordial tendency to identification. The details of this discussion exceed my purposes here. What's compelling, though, is Book-Jacobson's attunement to the ineluctable problem of individuation in psychoanalysis, the problem of being apart when one is always apart. As parts, we remain inextricably interconnected. Every attempt to be apart, to separate, involves connection at another point or on another plane. Following a nuanced treatment of Freud's writing on narcissism as symptomatically deploying sexuality in the context of Freud's own professional rivalries, Book-Jacobson turns to group psychology. He asks whether group psychology is premised on a possibility Freud can't let himself think and that he has perpetually to displace, namely, that of a mass ego, a primordial crowd. There is much to admire in Book-Jacobson's reading. I want to note where mine diverges from his. Rather than attending to the two different senses of the unconscious as a crowd in Freud, Book-Jacobson absorbs the dynamic in the structural. He treats the crowd unconscious, for Le Bon and Freud, as a womb, a soft, malleable, plastic, infinitely receptive material without will or desire or any specific instinct of its own. Crowd as matrical mass fits with Book-Jacobson's emphasis on the imaginary. It also fits with his critique of Freud insofar as Freud attempts to enclose the crowd within the form of the individual. The problem, however, is that neither Le Bon nor Freud presents the crowd as infinitely receptive and incapable of desire. Le Bon notes that influencing the crowd takes skill. The crowd senses its own strength and is thus intolerant of contradiction in those who speak before it. Since neither truth nor argument make a difference to crowds, they are not infinitely receptive. Le Bon emphasizes affirmation, repetition, and contagion as more promising methods of influence. Likewise, Freud says that the crowd may desire things passionately and that it can tolerate no delay between its desire and the fulfillment of what it desires. His primary argument is that crowds are tied together libidinally, they are products of desire. In short, the unconscious processes associated with the crowd are more subjectal than Book-Jacobson acknowledges. The collectivity desires and wills, destroys and creates. These attributes precede Freud's attempts to contain them in the unconscious of an individual whose own becoming subject is contingent upon this containment. Dollard advances beyond Book-Jacobson when he suggests that the unconscious as Freud describes it in group psychology takes place between the individual and the collective, in the very establishment of the ties between an individual, becoming a subject, and a group to which he would belong. Dollard declines to read Freud in terms of a collective unconscious because that would demand a defined collectivity, a community to which it would pertain, but no such pre-given community exists. Because Le Bon's crowds are heterogeneous as well as homogeneous, criminal as well as moral, forming a collective mind doubtless transitory, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics, however, I see no reason to presume a defined collectivity. Defined collectivity implies a collectivity that is known and inscribed rather than crowd characteristics, dynamics, and attributes that are themselves definable. It suggests bounded groups rather than momentary collectivities formed through a concentration of forces the exciting causes of which can only be retroactively determined. In group psychology, the unconscious is nothing but collective, an insight Freud attempts repeatedly to repress by enclosing its processes in an individual form never adequate to its task. Psychoanalysis as a field is possible and can contribute to the debates in crowd theory because the dynamics it investigates are already collective even as they are enclosed in the generic form of the individual. A provisional being formed of heterogeneous elements. Freud quotes extensively from the crowd. Two ideas significant for Le Bon's crowd concept appear in the first passage Freud lifts: the crowd as a source of new feelings, thoughts, and ideas, and the crowd as the novel consistency of a provisional being. First, individuals in a group are in the possession of a sort of collective mind that makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual one of them would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation. There are certain ideas and feelings which do not come into being, or do not transform themselves into acts except in the case of individuals forming a group. Second, the psychological group is a provisional being formed of heterogeneous elements, which for a moment are combined, exactly as the cells which constitute a living body form by their reunion a new being which displays characteristics very different from those possessed by each of the cells singly. Freud doesn't question the emergence of previously inexistent ideas and feelings. Nor does he challenge the notion of a new, provisional being. He fully assumes the idea that in a group, individuals combine into a temporary unity, a collectivity that did not exist prior to this combining. Freud wants to know what unites people in a crowd, what the character of the ties that bind them together is. Le Bon had not concerned himself with what unites people in a crowd because he begins from the fact of collectivity, the provisional being of the crowd, seeking to understand its effects. He thus tries to explain why actions and effects not previously possessed by individuals emerge in a crowd. Freud recounts Le Bon's three explanations. The first is that a crowd feels itself to have enormous power. This feeling of invincibility makes a person less likely to hold himself in check, which means that he yields to instincts he would otherwise restrain. Freud writes this off as unimportant. Of course, our deepest selves lack responsibility. The crowd enables the individual to throw off repressions. Le Bon is mistaken in taking the sentiment of invincible power as a cause for the appearance of something new. Nothing new is appearing. Rather, the impulses repressed in the unconscious have simply become free to manifest themselves. As Freud notes, his disagreement with Le Bon here stems from their differing accounts of the unconscious. Le Bon's racial mind lacks the dimension of the unconscious repressed conceptualized by psychoanalysis, so for him the crowd does give rise to something new, something that cannot be reduced to the substratum of hereditary influences. Freud's objection thus treats the dynamic Le Bon describes as a structure, shifting between the two senses of unconscious such that behavior in a crowd manifests what is contained in the human mind. More interesting to Freud is the second explanation Le Bon provides for the change effected by crowds: contagion. Contagion is kin to hypnosis in that it induces people to act in unexpected ways. Freud quotes Le Bon, "In a group every sentiment and act is contagious, and contagious to such a degree that an individual readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest." The third is suggestion. Freud fills the next page with Le Bon's description of the magnetic influence given out by the group, the vanishing of conscious personality and loss of will, the turning by means of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas in an identical direction, the tendency to immediately transform the suggested ideas into acts. Freud notes an asymmetry in Le Bon's account. Contagion refers to members' effects on each other. Suggestion, particularly when understood in terms of hypnosis, implies something else entirely, the operation of a hierarchical relation of influence. Who is the hypnotist? I should add here that even today nearly everyone who writes about crowds describes crowds in terms of contagion and suggestion. We see the language of contagion, for instance, in discussions of networked media as well as in depictions of the movements, protests, occupations, and riots erupting in the second decade of the 21st century. Momentarily setting aside the matter of the hypnotist, just as he did the question of group ties. Freud includes another long quote from Le Bon. By the mere fact that he forms part of an organized group, a man descends several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Isolated, he may be a cultivated individual; in a crowd, he is a barbarian, that is, a creature acting by instinct. He possesses the spontaneity, the violence, the ferocity, and also the enthusiasm and heroism of primitive beings. End of quotation from Le Bon. Freud approves, commending not just Le Bon's identification of the group mind with the mind of primitive people but also noting the convergence between crowd theory and psychoanalysis. What crowd theory has found in crowds, psychoanalysis has observed in the unconscious mental life of individuals, of children and of neurotics. The processes that Le Bon describes as changing the man in the crowd are for Freud indications of the crowd already in the man. He then repeats multiple elements of Le Bon's description, saying that the group is changeable, irritable, impulsive, credulous, incapable of persevering, desirous, intolerant of delays and the satisfaction of its desire, open to influence, and that it thinks in images. It has a sense of omnipotence, no personal interest, not even that of self-preservation, can make itself felt. The group is inclined to extremes, lacks a critical faculty and respects force. It has a thirst for obedience, it wants to be ruled and oppressed and to fear its masters. Groups demand illusions. Distinctions between truth and falsity matter little. Words function more magically than rationally. A group knows neither doubt nor certainty, a phenomenon of unconscious life that Freud reminds his readers he has already discussed in the interpretation of dreams. To reiterate, insofar as Le Bon conceives the crowd in terms of a dynamic wherein energies are concentrated in a single direction, he sees the force of crowds expressed in races, castes, classes, nations, juries, parties, and parliamentary assemblies. All these can override individual judgment and opinion, eliciting effects that exceed what an individual would rationally decide to do on his own. These are psychological crowds where crowd names the novel consistency temporarily formed from interlinked processes. The last third of the crowd examines the particular characteristics that arise when different collectivities are transformed into a crowd under the influences of the proper exciting causes. Most commentators on Le Bon miss this transformative dimension of Le Bon's crowd concept. They criticize him for blurring the boundaries of the crowd such that there is no difference between juries and mobs when they should commend him for drawing out the dynamics shaping collectivities. Freud doesn't miss this point because he doesn't share the sociologist's concern with classifying groups. His interest is in establishing the reputation of psychoanalysis by demonstrating its explanatory power. For Freud, whether an individual is physically in a group, in the crowd or in an institution, is no different from whether the group manifests itself in the individual, as with a nation or race. From the perspective of psychoanalysis, the individual in a crowd and subject to its emergent dynamics is just another instance of the individual as such, a fragile ego grappling with unevenly repressed desires and drives. From group psychology to individual psychology, and back. Although Freud praises the brilliance of Le Bon's depiction of the group mind, he's not satisfied with Le Bon's discussion of what ties the group together. This is where Freud thinks that psychoanalysis can contribute to crowd psychology. It can explain the desires and instincts that underlie group cohesion instead of taking for granted the primacy of an instinct to sociality. The liability to affect and intellectual inhibition that alters the individual in a crowd, Freud argues, should not be attributed to number, to a quantity of people. Instead, it can be explained with basic psychoanalytic concepts. Moving from many to one, Freud's explanation encloses the directed intensities of Le Bon's crowd into an individual unconscious. Collective desire is reduced to an amplification of frustrated individual desire. Forces associated with the crowd become unconscious processes within an individual. Freud works to prevent these processes from rupturing the individual, but his efforts at containment never quite succeed, held in place, ultimately, through the reassertion of the scientific myth of the primal horde. In his initial step toward enclosure, Freud criticizes the authorities on group psychology for appealing to suggestion in their attempts to understand crowd processes such as imitation and contagion, in other words, influence without logical foundation. Freud finds these accounts of suggestion circular. They rely on the idea that suggestibility is a fundamental mental fact, ein weiter nicht reduzierbares Phänomen. As Bork Jacobson writes, when Freud rises up against the tyranny of suggestion, he is of course militating in favor of the autonomy of the individual subject. Already in his shift from the active process of suggestion, disuggestion, to the more passive, receiving suggestibility, Disuggerierbarkeit, Freud takes a group process and makes it into an attribute of an individual. Looking behind the shelter, the screen, of suggestion, Freud finds love. Group ties are libidinal ties. The individual gives up his distinctiveness to the group because he wants to be in harmony with its members. Given the violent, disruptive, and volatile crowds Le Bon describes, this is a very strange move. Freud justifies it by faulting Le Bon for paying insufficient attention to the leader and by attending himself to groups that crowd theory typically ignores, the church and the army. This enables Freud to Oedipalize the crowd, to enclose it into the Oedipal relationships crucial to his theory of individual psychology. Church and army are each headed by a leader, Christ, commander, who loves all the individuals in the group with an equal love. The illusion of equal love is absolutely essential, Freud tells us. Everything depends on it. Christ stands in relation to the individuals in the church as an elder brother or father surrogate. Because of the equality of members, each shares equally in Christ's love. The church is like a family. Members call each other brother. The tie which unites each individual to Christ is also the cause of the tie which unites them with one another. The army is basically the same, with the fundamental difference being that this familial structure is repeated in a hierarchical fashion: sections, units, squadrons, etc. What matters here to Freud is the double nature of the libidinal tie of the group: individual to leader, individual to individual. Group ties have to be libidinal if they are to be strong enough to limit the narcissism that Freud attributes to the individual. Yet the forces Freud describes exceed the structure in which he wants to place them. He has been attempting to remedy the problem of the circularity of suggestion by appealing to libido. To cement his case, he considers the complicating example of panic, as discussed by another crowd theorist, William McDougall. On the one hand, panic means the disintegration of the group. On the other, it is an intensification of affect through contagion. This produces the paradox that what binds unbinds. Freud thinks that understanding group ties libidinally solves the problem insofar as panic is analogous to anxiety and is thus manifest because of an increase in danger or a cessation of emotional ties. Bork-Jacobson points out the resulting contortions this results in for Freud. Quotation by Bork-Jacobson. The disappearance of the libidinal political bond that ensured the cohesion of the group does not liberate narcissistic egos in a pure and simple unbonding. In a way, it liberates nothing at all, and especially not autonomous subjects, individuals, since panic consists precisely in an unmasterable overflowing of ego by way of, effects of, others, or, put somewhat differently, panic consists in a mimetic contagious epidemic narcissism. The example of panic is thus not the counterexample of the group. And Freud's argument can easily be turned around, by making panic the exemplary example of individual psychology. A paradoxical result is achieved, namely, that narcissism does away with itself in one of its most striking manifestations, since panic is tantamount to a gaping, more or less bewildered opening toward others. End of quotation by Bork-Jacobson. Another way to describe this same contortion is to note that it results from Freud's structuring of process. Panic is an effective force, a flow that disrupts as it moves. It is not the counterexample to the group or crowd because it is itself unleashed as a dispersion of crowd intensity. The problem Freud encounters is the result of his attempt to enclose this intensity in the form of the individual. Freud focuses on the scattered elements rather than the common dynamic that scatters them. There are further challenges Freud encounters as he deploys psychoanalysis against crowd theory and explains group ties as a reinforcing combination of aim-inhibited object love and mutual identification. At key points he illustrates his argument by appealing to girls and women, the hysterical sympathetic identification of boarding school girls longing for secret love affairs and the troop of women and girls crowded around a singer or pianist with whom they are all in love. Le Bon's fierce and powerful crowds ready to pillage a palace, or to die in defense of a stronghold or a barricade are diminished and truncated, enclosed in the bourgeois sites of boarding school and concert hall, the ferocity of collective power turned inward as identification through love for a shared object. Collective desire becomes nothing but common frustration. Bork-Jacobson explores Freud's discussion of the imbrication of identification and object love, drawing out the strange loops in Freud's efforts to shore up an individual ego, the emergence of which perpetually eludes him. Freud presents a graphic representation of these loops at the close of Chapter 8. I limit myself here to noting Freud's acknowledgement that we cannot for long enjoy the illusion that we have solved the riddle of the group with this formula. He recognizes that his discussion of church and army unfairly emphasizes the leader and keeps the other factor of mutual suggestion too much in the background. And he wonders whether it would have been simpler, more modest, just to accept the idea of a herd instinct. He invokes Wilfred Trotter, Instincts of the Herd in War and Peace, 1916. But he concludes no. There's no such thing as a primary herd instinct. What's at work is the more complex structure he already outlined, the one where multiple individuals identify with one another in their love for the same object. The reason the herd instinct doesn't explain groups is that it leaves no room for the leader, which Freud has already asserted to be crucial. The leader is necessary because he is that point in relation to which all the others are equal to one another. The members assert their equality to one another in light of the leader's superiority to them all. Freud presents the demand for equality as a reaction formation arising out of envy. If one can't have the special relation to the leader, no other shall either. The equality of the crowd is thus a kind of negative solidarity of rivals. Freud substitutes for the herd instinct a horde. Man is a horde animal, an individual creature in a horde led by a chief. For Freud, the primal horde is the originary form that the crowd revives. He notes that the dynamics associated with crowds, the dwindling of the conscious individual personality, the focusing of thoughts and feelings into a common direction, the predominance of the affective side of the mind and of unconscious psychical life are contained in his idea of the primal horde. Freud thereby morphs crowd processes into a closed, mythic, form of sociality. Group behavior corresponds to a regression to a primitive mental state. According to Freud's myth of the primal horde, because of the strong emotional ties connecting the group, there was only a common will, there were no single ones. Freud thus posits that the oldest psychology is group psychology. Individual psychology comes out of it by a gradual process which may still, perhaps, be described as incomplete. But he quickly corrects himself, making individual and group psychology co-primary. Why? Because of the leader, the free, strong, and willful father of the horde. This reintroduces the problem of individual psychology at another level, not just where this primal father comes from but how a member can become a leader. There must therefore be a possibility of transforming group psychology into individual psychology, which is precisely Freud's own task in group psychology. But his answer is nearly nonsensical. It turns back in on itself by suggesting that the sons were initially individuals forced by the primal father's sexual jealousy into group psychology, which would mean that individual psychology comes first. And it posits a successor who will be allowed access to women, breaking his libidinal ties to the group. Succession is force in reverse, as if the sons in the horde retained their initial individual desires rather than merging them in group psychology. Freud uses the myth to hold in place and conceal the disruption of the individual form of psychic structure by crowd processes. The myth narrates the processes together in a story where division is forced no less than connection and where the affective dynamics that disrupt are the same as those that bind. In a postscript to group psychology, as if compelled to make his myth itself more dynamic, Freud supplements his abbreviated discussion of the horde. He brings in the patricidal story from Totem and Taboo, which lets him add dissatisfaction, new developments, breakdown, and compensation to the myth. Freud does so in order to provide another origin for, a mythic myth of, the emergence of the individual from the group. In the elaborated myth, the first to break free of the group is the poet. The poet disguises the truth of the slaying of the father, putting a hero in the place of the crowd, present in fairy tales as the small animals and insects who help the hero accomplish his tasks. By creating the hero myth, the poet gives the group an idealized individual with whom each can identify. Each can imagine himself as the hero, acting alone and abolishing the one who oppresses them all. The poet, an imaginary figure of imagining, writes the individual into being, much as Freud himself does when he asserts the primacy of the father of the horde. The figures of leader and poet take the place of the crowd, becoming themselves models of subjectivity in its individuated form. As I mentioned, Freud finds Le Bon's discussion of the leader insufficient. In the crowd, Le Bon doesn't talk about leaders until midway through the text. When he does, he treats the leader as the nucleus of will around which a crowd forms, what we could also express in Lacanese as an object cause of crowd desire. The crowd doesn't desire the leader incites and directs the desire of the crowd. The leader is an instigator, an agitator whose intensity inspires the crowd and concentrates its attention. And even as Le Bon allows for the rare, great leaders of history, those whose will is so powerful and enduring that nothing resists it, neither nature, gods nor man, he focuses primarily on the fact that the leader begins as one of the led and that he is led himself, hypnotized by the idea as Robespierre was by Rousseau. The idea possesses the leader such that nothing else exists for him, which explains why leaders of the crowd are recruited from the ranks of the morbidly nervous, excitable, half-deranged persons who are bordering on madness. For Le Bon, the leader concentrates and transmits an idea, turning it into a cause of action. Indeed, he considers the possibility that mass periodicals may even be replacing the leader in that they, too, can simplify, consolidate, and transmit ideas. Rather than conceiving the leader as hypnotized, Freud treats the leader as hypnotist, The hypnotist asserts that he is in possession of a mysterious power that robs the subject of his own will, or, which is the same thing, the subject believes it of him. He argues further that the very uncanniness of hypnosis suggests something familiar but repressed, whether that of the child's relation to his parents or of the primal horde to the primal father. Freud thereby transfers a certain passivity in Le Bon's leader, fascination with the idea, to the crowd. The leader becomes active in their place. As primal father, the leader acquires a freedom, independence, and intellectual capacity altogether missing in Le Bon, even as he bears traces of the excesses of the crowd in his own furious enjoyment. Freud emphasizes that the father of the horde needs no reinforcement from others. Le Bon makes the leader himself a follower, a conduit for the natural instincts of a crowd no longer obedient to governmental authority. Just as Freud transposes the activity of the crowd onto the leader, so too does he transfer the crowd's creativity to the poet. Early in group psychology he acknowledges the genius of groups as is shown above all by language itself, as well as by folk song, folklore and the like. Le Bon had credited crowds with the creation of language. By the end of group psychology, creativity is the province of the individual, the singular poet who invents the heroic myth of the slaying of the father. Freud presents psychoanalysis as capable of explaining aspects of behavior in groups central to crowd theory. Where crowd theorists see numbers, contagion, and suggestion as innovating, as producing actions that are unexpected and uncontrollable, Freud finds the explicable patterns of individual psychology, nothing new here, except Freud's own findings. The collective subjectivity of Le Bon's powerful, sovereign, often criminal and sometimes heroic crowd is incorporated in an individual figured as leader or poet, and the individual form becomes itself the site of struggling desires, drives, ideals, and anxieties, organic processes localized at best in a provisional being formed of heterogeneous elements. So rather than explaining the crowd, Freud encloses it, fragilely and awkwardly. Where there were many, there appears one. Psychoanalysis's attempt to account for collective desire condenses and displaces it into the individual form. Perhaps surprisingly, we learn more about collective subjectivity from the notorious Le Bon than we do from Freud. Conclusion. If the subject is interpolated as an individual, the strengths of many become the imaginary attributes of one. The individual appears as the locus of a capacity for innovation and interruption that is only ever an effect of collectivities. If bourgeois ideology is the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence, as we learn from Althusser, these conditions will be represented repeatedly as individual matters of individual preference and choice, belief, and circumstance. The contradictions constitutive of capitalist relations will exist side by side, appearing as so many dreams or neuroses. Collectivity, in turn, will be figured derivatively, in the shadow of the individual such that the subjectivity it evinces fails to appear as an effect of a subject. Rather than as the dynamic force of the crowd, desire appears as personal longing. Rather than an inescapable circuit of activity, drive appears as addiction. While the subject of psychoanalysis is not the reasonable, self-aware subject of liberalism, when the unconscious is rendered as that of an individual, psychoanalysis is drafted into its service as covered support for an individuated subjectivity conceived in terms of a rational and knowable will. Recognizing the collective as a subject becomes all the more challenging because the terms of what counts as the act of a subject are truncated and distorted. Rather than heterogeneous, conflictual, temporary, unbounded, and in need of support from objects and figures that exceed it, the subject as individual is impossibly, fantastically independent and enduring. The crowd becomes unconscious again in the continued operation of enclosure affected by the individual form. Althusser asks why the relation given to individuals of their collective material life is an imaginary relation. My answer is that it is imaginary because it is given to them as individuals. Althusser, though, tries a different explanation, one that emphasizes practices of belief, kneeling, praying, shaking hands. He wants to get at the material dimension of ideology and practices, but he misses the ways these practices are collective, generic. In themselves, they are not individuating but rather the practices of a body of believers, a collectivity. Deploying Freud as backup, Althusser nevertheless asserts that individuals are always already subjects, particularly to the extent that they are born into a family, a place. It is certain in advance that it will bear its father's name, and will therefore have an identity and be irreplaceable. His assertion points not to the inevitability of subjection but to the specificity of interpolation as an individual in the bourgeois family. In this regard, Althusser intermixes generic and naming practices, failing to distinguish between those that involve groups and those that single out an individual by name. Le Bon is an odious reactionary. The crowd sounds the alarm, alerting elites to the threat of mass power and giving the rest of us a window into the will formed, expressed, and unleashed as that of a collective subject. Collectivity brings with it a sense of invincibility, an immense courage and capacity to put self-interest aside. It is accompanied by an unshakable equality, a demand for justice that Freud acknowledges even as he derives it from an original envy. The exciting causes of the crowd's directed intensity are unpredictable and temporary, which adds to the anxiety of elites endeavoring to hold on to the privilege they associate with their individuality before they are themselves swept up, compelled into thoughts and actions they abhor. Destructive, creative, unpredictable, temporary, and intense, the crowd expresses the paradoxical power of the people as subject,